A single dollar. Wrinkled. Worn at the edges. Smelling faintly of rain and survival. This was all 12-year-old Andrew Roy had left in the entire world. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His stomach twisted with hunger, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. But when he saw the woman sitting on that bench, tears streaming down her face, clutching a phone to her chest like it was her last connection to life, Andrew didn't hesitate. He walked over. He placed that dollar into her trembling hand. And what happened in the next 72 hours would change everything. Not just for Andrew. Not just for that woman. But for an entire community that had forgotten what it meant to see the humanity in someone they had already written off as invisible. This is the story of how one act of impossible kindness created a ripple effect so powerful it would bring an entire city to its knees. And trust me, you're not ready for what happens at the end. Andrew Roy was born on a Tuesday in November, during the first snowfall Chicago had seen that year. His mother, Catherine, used to tell him that the snow was heaven's way of celebrating his arrival, that God had thrown a party in the sky just for him. She'd laugh when she said it, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and Andrew believed her with every fiber of his young heart. Because when you're a child and your mother tells you that heaven celebrates your existence, you don't question it. You just hold on to it like a treasure. For the first 9 years of his life, Andrew knew what it meant to be loved. Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms in a building where the elevator never worked and the hallway always smelled like someone else's dinner. But Catherine Roy had a gift for making that cramped space feel like a palace. She hung Christmas lights around the windows in every season, not just December, because she said there was no rule that said beauty had to wait for holidays. She kept a jar on the kitchen counter filled with folded pieces of paper, each one containing a written reason why she was grateful. Every Sunday night, Andrew and his mother would sit together and read 3 of them out loud. I'm grateful for my son's laugh. I'm grateful for sunshine after rain. I'm grateful that we have each other. Andrew's father had left before his 2nd birthday. There were no memories of him, just a name on a birth certificate and a silence that Catherine never tried to fill with bitterness. When Andrew asked about him, and he did ask, his mother would simply say, "Some people aren't ready to stay, baby. It doesn't mean you weren't worth staying for. It means they had their own battles to fight, battles too heavy to carry while holding someone else's hand. Maybe one day he'll find his way back. But even if he doesn't, you have me. And I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. Until she couldn't anymore. Catherine worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and waitressing at a diner during the day. She'd come home with her feet swollen and her back aching, but she never complained in front of Andrew. Instead, she'd kick off her shoes, pull him close, and ask about his day with such genuine curiosity that Andrew felt like the most important person in the universe. She checked his homework with tired eyes that still managed to sparkle with pride when he got his answers right. She made sure he had clean clothes for school, even if it meant she wore the same 3 outfits all week. She sacrificed in silence, and Andrew, with the innocence of childhood, didn't fully understand the weight she carried. Then, 3 days after Andrew turned 9, everything shattered. It happened in the early morning hours, while Andrew slept peacefully in his bed, dreaming of the birthday cake his mother had promised to make that weekend. Catherine was walking home from her night shift, taking the shortcut through Patterson Alley like she'd done 100 times before. The police said it was a robbery gone wrong. Someone had wanted her purse, the old brown one with the broken zipper that contained exactly $14 and a photo of Andrew from kindergarten. She had resisted. Not because of the money, but because of that photo. Because she carried her son's face everywhere she went, and the thought of losing it was unbearable. They found her the next morning. The hospital called her emergency contact, her sister Patricia, who showed up at the apartment door at 7 in the morning with swollen eyes and a social worker standing behind her. Andrew knew something was wrong the moment he saw his aunt's face. Patricia had always been the loud one, the one who laughed too hard at her own jokes and spoke in exclamation points. But that morning she was silent. And silence from Patricia was louder than any scream. The funeral was small. Andrew wore a borrowed suit that was 2 sizes too big, and he stood at the graveside with his aunt's hand gripping his shoulder so tightly it left bruises. He didn't cry. Not because he wasn't devastated, but because his body had gone into a state of shock so profound that tears seemed impossible. His mother was gone. The woman who hung Christmas lights in September. The woman who read gratitude notes on Sunday nights. The woman who promised she wasn't going anywhere. She was gone, and Andrew couldn't make sense of a world that could be so cruel. For the next 2 years, Andrew lived with Aunt Patricia. But Patricia wasn't Catherine. She had her own struggles, a gambling addiction that she hid behind closed doors, a string of boyfriends who drifted in and out like seasonal weather, and a resentment toward the responsibility that had suddenly been thrust upon her. She fed Andrew, kept him in school, and technically provided shelter. But there was no warmth. No Christmas lights in every season. No jar of gratitude. Just survival in its most mechanical form. Then Patricia met a man named Raymond who didn't like children. Especially children that weren't his own. Especially children who reminded him that Patricia had obligations beyond their relationship. The argument started small but grew louder, more violent. Things were thrown. Doors were slammed. And Andrew learned to make himself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to become a ghost in a house that had never truly been his home. On the night of his 12th birthday, Patricia sat him down at the kitchen table with a look on her face that Andrew recognized. It was the same look the social worker had worn 3 years earlier. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice flat and distant. "Raymond and I are moving to Nevada. And there's no room for you where we're going." Andrew waited for her to say more. To explain. To apologize. To offer some alternative. But she just stared at him, waiting for him to react, waiting for him to cry or scream or beg. He did none of those things. Instead, he simply asked, "When do I have to leave?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll give you some money. Enough to get you started somewhere else." She gave him $47 and a garbage bag containing his clothes. She didn't hug him goodbye. She didn't wish him well. She just closed the door behind him, and that was it. Andrew stood on the sidewalk outside the apartment building where he'd lived for 2 years, a garbage bag in one hand and $47 in the other, and he realized that he was completely and utterly alone in the world. He was 12 years old. It was November, and it was starting to snow. The first night was the hardest. Not because of the cold, though the cold was brutal and unforgiving. Not because of the hunger, though his stomach growled so loudly it kept him awake. The first night was the hardest because reality hadn't fully set in yet, and Andrew kept waiting to wake up from what he desperately hoped was just a nightmare. He found a spot behind a grocery store, wedged between a dumpster and a concrete wall that blocked some of the wind. He wrapped himself in every piece of clothing from that garbage bag, layering shirts on top of shirts, trying to create insulation with fabric alone. He didn't sleep. He just stared at the sky, watching snowflakes fall, and wondered if heaven was still throwing parties for his arrival. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Andrew learned the geography of survival, which shelters had space and which ones turned away children traveling alone, which restaurant employees would leave extra food by the back door, which corners were safe to sleep on and which ones belonged to older, harder men who didn't want competition. He learned to read people's faces, to know within seconds whether someone would offer help or contempt. Most offered neither. Most just walked past him like he wasn't there, their eyes sliding over his existence like water over glass. The city of Chicago didn't see Andrew Roy. They saw a homeless kid, a statistic, a problem that someone else should solve. They saw the dirt on his face and the holes in his shoes and the way he hunched his shoulders against the wind. They made assumptions. They crossed the street to avoid walking too close. They locked their car doors when he approached intersections. A few tossed coins without making eye contact, assuaging their guilt without acknowledging his humanity. But most just looked away because looking meant seeing, and seeing meant feeling, and feeling meant responsibility. Andrew understood this. He didn't blame them, not entirely. He knew that his appearance told a story that made people uncomfortable. His dark skin, already a mark of suspicion in certain neighborhoods, combined with the visible evidence of his circumstances, created a narrative that strangers wrote before he ever opened his mouth. Dangerous. Troubled. Someone else's problem. He saw it in the tightening of purse straps, the subtle stepping away, The way conversations shifted to whispers when he walked past. He was 12 years old and the world had already decided who he was. But Andrew held on to something that the streets couldn't take from him. He held on to his mother's voice. At night, when the cold made his bones ache and the loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight, he would close his eyes and remember the things she taught him. Kindness costs nothing, baby, but it's worth everything. You can't control what people think about you, but you can control who you actually are. When you have nothing left to give, give anyway. Because giving reminds you that you're still human. He thought about that a lot. He thought about what it meant to be human in circumstances that seemed designed to strip away humanity. And he made a decision, somewhere in the depths of that first brutal winter, that no matter what happened to him, he would not let the world's coldness freeze his heart. It was a Thursday in early March. The snow had finally started to melt, leaving behind puddles of gray slush that soaked through Andrew's worn sneakers with every step. He'd found $2 that morning, one on the ground outside a coffee shop, another handed to him by an elderly man who called him son and told him to stay warm. $2 felt like a fortune. It meant a hot meal at the dollar menu of a fast food restaurant. It meant, for a few minutes, the sensation of warmth spreading through his empty stomach. He was walking toward the McDonald's on 47th Street when he passed the bus stop bench. And that's when he saw her. The woman was white, somewhere in her late 30s, with auburn hair that had escaped from a loose ponytail and now hung around her face in tangled strands. She wore a coat that looked expensive, the kind with a designer label that Andrew had seen in store windows but never touched. Her shoes matched her purse, leather, polished, clearly not purchased from any store Andrew had ever been inside. Everything about her screamed privilege. Everything about her screamed, different world. But her face told another story entirely. Her eyes were red and swollen, the kind of swollen that comes from hours of crying. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in dark rivers that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. She was clutching her phone with both hands, staring at the screen like it contained either a lifeline or a death sentence, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. She looked, Andrew thought, like someone whose entire world had just collapsed. He should have kept walking. That's what survival demanded. Mind your own business. Protect your resources. Don't draw attention. Don't engage. He had $2, two precious dollars, and a destination that would turn those dollars into temporary relief from the gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving. But Andrew heard his mother's voice, clear as if she was standing right beside him. Kindness costs nothing, baby. But it's worth everything. He walked over to the bench and sat down beside her. Not too close, because he'd learned that his presence made people uncomfortable. Just close enough to be heard. "Are you okay?" he asked. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes took in his appearance, the layers of dirty clothing, the backpack held together with duct tape, the face that hadn't seen a proper shower in weeks. He watched her expression cycle through surprise, then discomfort, then something that looked almost like fear. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, clutching her phone tighter, as if she expected him to snatch it from her hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Andrew said softly. You look really sad. And I wanted to make sure you were okay." Something in his voice must have broken through her defenses, because her expression shifted. The fear faded, replaced by confusion and then, unexpectedly, fresh tears. "No," she whispered. "I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all." Her name was Caroline Ashford, and she told Andrew her story with the kind of raw, unfiltered honesty that strangers sometimes share, precisely because they are strangers and there are no consequences to the confession. She had woken up that morning in a penthouse apartment on the Gold Coast, with a view of Lake Michigan that people paid millions for the privilege of seeing. She had a husband, Thomas, who worked in finance and made more money in a month than most people made in a year. She had 2 children, twin girls who were currently at a private school that cost more annually than a college education. She had everything that society said she should want. And she had just discovered that none of it was real. Thomas had been having an affair. Not a brief indiscretion, but a 3-year relationship with his executive assistant, a woman named Jennifer who was carrying his child. Caroline had found the emails that morning, accidentally, while looking for a receipt on his laptop. 3 years of lies, documented in black and white. 3 years of whispered phone calls and weekend business trips, and the slow, systematic dismantling of everything Caroline thought her life was built upon. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the phone call she'd received 20 minutes before Andrew sat down beside her. Thomas's lawyer, informing her that her husband had moved to freeze their joint accounts. That he was filing for divorce and seeking primary custody of the twins. That Caroline, who had given up her career 15 years ago to raise his children and support his ambitions, was about to lose everything. The penthouse. The lifestyle. Possibly even her daughters. Because Thomas had money, and money bought lawyers, and lawyers won cases. "I have nothing," Caroline said, her voice hollow. "I thought I had everything, but I have nothing. I don't even have cab fare to get home. He canceled my credit cards this morning. All of them. I've been sitting here for 2 hours trying to figure out what to do, and I can't even afford the bus." Andrew listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He just listened, with a depth of attention that Caroline had rarely experienced even from people who claimed to love her. When she finished, she let out a bitter laugh. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. You probably have enough problems of your own without listening to some rich woman complain about her divorce." "Everybody's problems are real," Andrew said. "Pain doesn't check your bank account before it shows up." Caroline stared at him. This child, this homeless child with dirt on his face and holes in his shoes, had just said something more profound than anything her therapist had ever told her. Andrew reached into his pocket and pulled out his $2. One of them, the one he'd found on the ground, was dirty and crumpled. The other, the one the elderly man had given him, was slightly less worn. He smoothed both of them out on his knee, considering. Then he took the better of the 2 bills and held it out toward Caroline. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it'll get you on the bus. You can get home." Caroline looked at the dollar like it was a foreign object. Then she looked at Andrew. Then back at the dollar. "I can't take that," she said. "You need it more than I do." "Maybe," Andrew agreed. "But you need it right now. And right now matters." "But what about you? What will you eat?" Andrew shrugged. "I'll figure something out. I always do." "This is insane," Caroline said, but she was crying again, different tears now, tears that seemed to come from a different place entirely. "I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself because my husband is leaving me, and meanwhile, you're living on the street, and you're trying to give me your money. This is insane." "My mama used to say that kindness is how we stay human," Andrew said. "That when you have nothing left to give, you should give anyway. Because it reminds you that you're more than just what's happening to you." Caroline took the dollar. Her hand was shaking as she accepted it, and when her fingers brushed against Andrew's, she noticed how cold they were. This child was freezing and hungry and alone, and he was giving away his last resources to a stranger who, by any objective measure, had lived a life of unimaginable privilege. "What's your name?" she asked. "Andrew. Andrew Roy." "Andrew," she repeated as if committing it to memory. "I'm Caroline. And I promise you, I will never forget what you did today. Never." Caroline went home that night, riding the bus for the first time in over a decade, clutching the crumpled dollar bill in her pocket like it was made of gold. She walked into the penthouse that would no longer be hers, looked at the expensive furniture and the lake views and the countless material possessions that filled every room, and she felt something shift inside her. All of this stuff, she realized, and none of it had given her a fraction of the peace she'd felt sitting on that bench, being seen by a 12-year-old boy who had nothing but somehow gave everything. She found her daughter's piggy banks. She raided her jewelry box, pulling out pieces that Thomas had given her over the years, gilt gifts, she now realized, purchased after each of his business trips. She gathered everything of value that was unambiguously hers and sold it within 48 hours. The amount was enough to hire her own lawyer, one who specialized in cases exactly like hers. But more importantly, it was enough to give her something she hadn't felt in years: agency. Control over her own narrative. Meanwhile, Andrew returned to his spot behind the grocery store. He was hungry that night, hungrier than he'd been in weeks, but something felt different. He couldn't explain it, but giving away that dollar hadn't emptied him. It had, in some strange way, filled him up with something else entirely. He thought about Caroline, about the look on her face when she took the money, and he hoped she'd made it home safely. He hoped she'd be okay. And hoping for someone else's well-being, he realized, made his own circumstances feel slightly less crushing. He fell asleep that night with his mother's voice in his head. "I'm proud of you, baby. So proud." Caroline couldn't stop thinking about Andrew. In the weeks that followed, as her divorce proceedings began and her life descended into legal chaos, the memory of that boy on the bench became an anchor. When Thomas's lawyers tried to intimidate her, she thought of Andrew facing each day with nothing and no one. When she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of starting over, she remembered his simple words, "Right now matters." She started looking for him. It began casually, driving through the neighborhood where they'd met, scanning bus stops and street corners, hoping to catch a glimpse of that face. But casual searching yielded nothing, and Caroline became more determined. She contacted homeless shelters, showing them a sketch she'd had drawn from memory. She reached out to social workers, explaining that she was looking for a specific child. She put up flyers, though she felt absurd doing so, like she was searching for a lost pet rather than a human being who had changed her perspective on everything. But Chicago was a big city, and homeless children were, tragically, not rare. And Andrew, like so many others in his situation, had become adept at being invisible. He moved from spot to spot, never staying anywhere long enough to establish a pattern. He was surviving, but survival meant constant motion, constant vigilance, constant adaptation. The search went on for weeks, then months. Caroline's divorce was finalized. She received custody of her daughters, along with a settlement that, while far less than Thomas had originally promised, was enough to start fresh. She bought a modest townhouse in a middle-class neighborhood, enrolled the girls in public school, and began rebuilding her life from the ground up. But she never stopped looking for Andrew. She never stopped hoping that somehow, somewhere, she would find him again. It was now September. Andrew had been on the streets for 10 months, and the cumulative toll of homelessness was becoming impossible to ignore. He was thinner than he'd ever been, his clothes hanging off a frame that seemed to shrink a little more each week. He'd developed a cough that wouldn't go away, a deep, rattling sound that echoed through his chest with every breath. The nights were getting colder again, and Andrew knew, with a grim certainty that no 12-year-old should possess, that another winter on the streets might be more than he could survive. He'd stopped reaching out to shelters. Too many of them required parental consent or threatened to call social services, which meant foster care, which meant a system that Andrew had heard horror stories about. He'd rather take his chances on the streets, where at least he was free, than end up in a situation where he had no control at all. But freedom, he was learning, came at a cost. And that cost was slowly killing him. The night everything changed, Andrew was huddled behind his usual grocery store, wrapped in a blanket he'd pulled from a donation bin earlier that week. The cough had gotten worse, and every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. He was running a fever, though he didn't have a thermometer to confirm it. He just knew that his body was burning from the inside while the outside shivered uncontrollably. This, he thought, might be it. This might be how the story ends. He closed his eyes and thought about his mother, about Christmas lights in every season, about gratitude jars and Sunday night readings, about the promise she'd made, the one she couldn't keep. "I miss you, Mama," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm trying so hard to stay human. But I'm so tired." Caroline Ashford had spent the evening at her daughter's school, attending a parent-teacher conference that had run 2 hours longer than expected. She was exhausted, her mind preoccupied with the endless details of her new life, and she almost didn't notice the detour sign that redirected traffic away from her usual route home. The construction forced her down unfamiliar streets, past businesses and alleyways she'd never had reason to notice before. She was stopped at a red light, scrolling absently through her phone, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Someone was emerging from behind a grocery store, stumbling into the pool of light cast by a street lamp. A child. A thin, frail child who took 3 steps forward before collapsing onto the sidewalk. Caroline's heart stopped. Without thinking, she threw her car into park, right there at the intersection, and ran. When she reached the fallen figure and turned them over, her breath caught in her throat. The face was thinner, the cheekbones more prominent. The skin had an unhealthy pallor that hadn't been there before. But she would recognize him anywhere. "Andrew," she breathed. "Oh my God. Andrew." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. He looked at her without recognition, too sick to process what was happening. But Caroline didn't need him to recognize her. She just needed him to survive. She gathered him into her arms. He weighed almost nothing, this child who should have been growing and thriving, and carried him to her car. She drove straight to the emergency room, breaking every speed limit along the way, praying to a God she'd neglected for years that she hadn't found him too late. The next 72 hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, and doctors speaking in clinical terms that Caroline forced herself to understand. Pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and exposure. Andrew's body, pushed beyond its limits for far too long, was fighting a battle it might not win. He was placed on 4 antibiotics, fluids, oxygen support. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words that made no sense, sometimes crying out for his mother. Caroline stayed by his bedside. She told the hospital staff that she was a family friend, though the truth was more complicated than any simple label could capture. She held his hand through the worst of it, through the fever spikes and the labored breathing, and she talked to him constantly, hoping her voice would give him something to hold on to. "You're not alone anymore," she told him. "Do you hear me, Andrew? You're not alone. You saved me when I had nothing left to hope for, and now I'm going to make sure you're okay. You just have to fight. You just have to hold on." On the 3rd day, Andrew's fever broke. His eyes opened, clearer now, and when he saw Caroline sitting beside him, his forehead creased in confusion. The lady from the bench," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Caroline said, tears streaming down her face. "And you're the boy who reminded me that kindness is how we stay human." As Andrew recovered, they talked. He told her everything, about his mother, about Aunt Patricia, about the months of survival that had brought him to that alley behind the grocery store. He spoke without self-pity, laying out the facts of his life with a maturity that broke Caroline's heart. No child should have to be this strong, she thought. No child should have to carry this much alone. Caroline told him about her own journey since they'd met. About the divorce, the custody battle, the townhouse in the suburbs where she was building a new life with her daughters. About how that single dollar had become a symbol for her, a reminder that generosity was possible even in moments of complete depletion. "I've been looking for you," she confessed. "For months. I never stopped hoping I'd find you again." "Why?" Andrew asked. "I'm nobody. I'm just a kid." "You're not nobody," Caroline said firmly. "You're the person who showed me that character isn't determined by circumstance. That compassion doesn't require resources. That the human heart is capable of giving even when it has nothing left." She paused, taking his hand. "You're the reason I had the courage to fight for my daughters instead of just giving up. You probably don't understand how important that dollar was, Andrew. But it changed my life." Andrew was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My mama used to tell me that kindness was worth more than anything money could buy. I guess maybe she was right." "She was absolutely right," Caroline said. "And I'd like to meet her standards. If you'll let me." Caroline approached the subject carefully, knowing that trust was not something Andrew could give freely after everything he'd been through. She explained that she had spoken with social workers, with lawyers, with everyone necessary to make what she was about to suggest actually possible. "I want to adopt you," she said. "I want you to come live with me and my daughters. I want to give you the home you deserve." Andrew stared at her, unable to speak. This had to be a dream. This had to be some fever-induced hallucination that would evaporate the moment he tried to touch it. People didn't do this. Not in his world. Not in any world he'd ever known. "I know it's a lot to take in," Caroline continued, "and I'm not asking you to decide right now. But I need you to know that this isn't charity. This isn't pity. This is me wanting you in my life because of who you are. Because you showed me something beautiful about humanity at a moment when I'd forgotten it existed. But your daughters, Andrew said, they don't even know me. What if they don't want? I've talked to them, Caroline said. I told them about the boy who gave his last dollar to a stranger. About the boy who reminded their mother how to hope. They want to meet you, Andrew. They want to be your sisters. For the first time in almost a year, Andrew Roy cried. Not from sadness or hunger or cold, but from something he'd almost forgotten existed, joy. Pure, overwhelming, terrifying joy. The transition wasn't easy. Andrew had spent nearly a year trusting no one, relying only on himself, and learning to be part of a family again required unlearning habits that had kept him alive on the streets. He flinched at sudden movements. He hoarded food in his room, unable to believe that there would always be more. He woke up in the night, panicked, certain that this was all a trick and he would soon find himself back in that alley. But Caroline was patient. Her daughters, Lily and Rose, were patient. They gave Andrew space when he needed it and presence when he craved it. They learned his signals, understood his triggers, and slowly, over weeks and months, they built something that felt increasingly like a real family. Caroline enrolled Andrew in school, where he struggled initially. He'd missed so much during his time on the streets, but eventually began to thrive. He was smart, hungry for knowledge in a way that surprised even his teachers. He devoured books like they were the food he'd once been denied, and his grades climbed steadily until he was near the top of his class. On his 13th birthday, Caroline threw him a party. Nothing extravagant, just cake and ice cream and a small gathering of the friends he'd made at school. But she also gave him something else. A jar. Empty, except for a single folded piece of paper at the bottom. This is for gratitude, Caroline explained. Every Sunday night we're going to write down the things we're thankful for. And we're going to read them together. Because someone very wise once taught me that remembering the good things helps us survive the bad ones. Andrew opened the jar and pulled out the paper. Unfolded it. Read the words written in Caroline's careful handwriting. I'm grateful for the boy who gave a stranger his last dollar and reminded me what humanity looks like. Word of Andrew's story began to spread. Caroline, without seeking publicity, had shared their journey with a few close friends. Those friends told others. A local journalist heard about it and asked for an interview. Before long, Andrew Roy was no longer invisible. He was a symbol of something the city desperately needed to see. The story went viral. Not because it was sensational, but because it was true. A homeless black child, overlooked and underestimated by everyone, had possessed more compassion than people with every advantage. A wealthy woman, stripped of everything she thought mattered, had found redemption through connection with someone society had discarded. The narrative challenged assumptions, broke down barriers, forced people to question who they walked past without seeing. Donations poured in, not to Caroline, who didn't need them, but to homeless shelters and youth services and organizations working to ensure no child ever had to face what Andrew had faced. The city launched new initiatives to address youth homelessness, citing Andrew's story as the catalyst. But the greatest ripple effect wasn't institutional. It was personal. It was the countless individuals who, after hearing about the boy who gave his last dollar, reconsidered their own responses to those in need. Who paused before looking away. Who offered a meal, a conversation, a moment of human recognition. Who remembered that kindness costs nothing but is worth everything. 1 year after Caroline had found him collapsed in that alley, Andrew asked to visit his mother's grave. It was the first time he'd been back since the funeral, and Caroline drove him without question, understanding that some journeys had to be taken. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in autumn sunlight that made the grass glow golden. Andrew walked to the headstone alone, while Caroline waited at a respectful distance. He stood there for a long time, looking at the name carved in stone, remembering the woman who had taught him everything that mattered. "Hey, Mama," he said finally, his voice thick. "It's been a while." He told her about everything. About the streets and the cold and the nights when he'd almost given up. About the woman on the bench and the dollar and the impossible series of events that had led him here. about Lily and Rose and Sunday night gratitude readings and a new home filled with people who actually wanted him. "You were right," he said. "About kindness. About giving even when you have nothing. You were right about all of it." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I just wish you could see it. I wish you could meet Caroline and know that I'm okay. That I'm more than okay." He placed a single flower on the grave, a daisy, his mother's favorite, and stood in silence for a moment longer. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Caroline had approached quietly and now stood beside him. "I know it's not the same," she said softly. "I could never replace her. But I promise you, Andrew, I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor what she taught you." "You already do," Andrew said. "Every single day." Andrew Roy graduated high school with honors. He gave a speech at graduation that left the auditorium in tears, a speech about invisible children and visible kindness and the power of one moment to change everything. He went to college on a full scholarship, studying social work, determined to spend his life helping kids who were still trapped in the circumstances he'd escaped. During his junior year, he founded a nonprofit organization called The Last Dollar Project. Its mission was simple: provide emergency resources to homeless and at-risk youth, no questions asked, no bureaucracy, just immediate help when it was needed most. The name came from his story, of course, but the spirit came from his mother. From those Sunday night gratitude readings. From the jar that sat on Caroline's kitchen counter, now filled to overflowing with hundreds of folded papers. The organization grew. It opened chapters in cities across the country. It helped thousands of young people access food, shelter, education, and hope. And every time a volunteer welcomed a new kid into one of their programs, they said the same words that had become the organization's motto. "You are seen. You matter. And we're not going anywhere." Here's what Andrew Roy understood that most people spend lifetimes failing to learn. Wealth has nothing to do with money. Security has nothing to do with circumstances. And humanity has everything to do with choice. On the day he gave his last dollar to a crying stranger on a bus stop bench, Andrew had nothing. No home. No family. No certainty that he would survive the week. By every external measure, he was among the poorest people in the world. But he was richer than people with millions in the bank, because he possessed something that couldn't be bought or sold. He possessed compassion in a world that had given him every reason to be bitter. He possessed generosity in circumstances that demanded selfishness for survival. He possessed the understanding, passed down from a mother who was gone but not forgotten, that kindness was not a luxury of the comfortable but a lifeline for the soul. Caroline Ashford had thought she lost everything the day she discovered her husband's betrayal. And in one sense she had. She lost the life she knew, the future she'd imagined, the stability she'd taken for granted. But in losing all of that, she found something she didn't know she was missing. She found perspective. She found humility. She found the courage to rebuild on a foundation that couldn't be taken away, because it was built on values rather than valuables. And she found Andrew. Or perhaps, more accurately, Andrew found her. A 12-year-old boy with nothing to his name except a crumpled dollar and a mother's teachings, who reached out to a stranger in pain because that's what you do when you've decided to stay human regardless of what the world throws at you. There's someone in your life right now who needs what Andrew gave Caroline. Not money. Not solutions. Just the acknowledgement that they exist. The recognition that they matter. The simple, radical act of stopping to ask, "Are you okay?" You don't have to adopt them. You don't have to fix their problems. You don't have to give away your last dollar, though if you did, you might be surprised at what comes back to you. You just have to see them. Really see them. Because we are all at different points in our lives, the crying woman on the bench and the homeless child with nothing left. We are all sometimes desperate for someone to acknowledge our humanity. Andrew Roy changed the world. Not because he was special, though he was. Not because he was lucky, though he found luck in unexpected places. He changed the world because he made a choice. A choice to give when he had nothing. A choice to care when he had every reason not to. A choice to believe that kindness was worth more than survival. What choice will you make today? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the people you pass on the street or the way you show up for strangers in pain, I'm asking you to do two things. First, share this video. Not for the algorithm, not for the views, but because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear Andrew's story. Someone who has forgotten that they matter. Someone who has given up on kindness because the world has been unkind to them. Share this, and you might be the reason they remember. Second, do something today. It doesn't have to be big. Pay for someone's coffee. Hold a door. Make eye contact with someone you would normally look past and offer them a genuine smile. Write a gratitude note and leave it where a stranger will find it. Be the person who reminds the world that humanity hasn't disappeared, that compassion still exists, that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness lights the way forward. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And leave a comment below telling me about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your life, or when you were the stranger who showed up for someone else. Because that's how we honor Andrew. That's how we honor his mother. That's how we build the world they believed was possible. $1 at a time. One act of kindness at a time. One choice at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you in advance for what you're about to do next.